All right, well, hi, my name is Finn,
And I'm Zach.
and today we're talking about.
The Canadian federal election.
And now we're here. Welcome, Zach, to our Canadian election special.
Heck yeah.
It's-
Canadian politics. Who doesn't love it? The most interesting country politically in the world.
That's very true. That's very true. Well, welcome to the United States.
Thank you very much.
You're from Canada.
I am from Canada. I was born and raised, I was born in Burnaby, British Columbia, which is driving distance from here.
Right. And you live like just 10 minutes over the border, you said?
Yep. Langley, British Columbia. I live in the Murrayville neighborhood, about 10 minutes from the Linden-Aldergrove border there.
Wow, that's a lot of. You're giving a lot of personal detail out. You want to
Ah,
give me your
that's
address
fine.
too?
Yeah,
and,
you know what? 5 3. No, I'm joking. But yeah, no, it was a nice drive down. I really enjoy the campus around here. Actually, it's very it feels very at home. It reminds me a lot of my own, but just a little bit more spread out.
Spread out, nice.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. What? I'm trying to. There's so much to talk about.
There definitely is. Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out where to start. I think I'll start with this. So I have lived in Bellingham
Yes.
basically my whole life,
Okay.
and so, but I actually never. I hadn't gone to Canada. The first time I went to Canada, I was like 16. Actually,
Okay.
it was for like a high school band trip.
Gotcha.
And it was like, it's very similar to the United States. It was just like entering this slightly different parallel universe where
Yeah.
everything's in kilometers and the money's a little bit different, but like it's
Indeed.
supposed to be the same. But I never really had growing up, I never really had a strong perception of Canada as like truly a different country. And I don't mean that in like a political sense, like it's just part of the United States or something, which
Indeed.
we'll get into
Okay,
that
I
in a minute.
appreciate that. Yeah.
But more
The
of that,
distinction.
like because it's so culturally similar, it didn't feel like there was such a hard separation between the United States and Canada, because I would see Canadian license plates all the time, and I would get Canadian TV, and so it felt like there was very. What was your experience, or like what was your perception of the United States growing up, living so close to the border?
Okay. Well, I would guess. I guess I would say that a lot of Canadian identity, especially when you're young, when you're going through that sort of political socialization through, your community, your education, and those sorts of things. The way that we always looked at ourselves, at least when I was young, was like we're like America, but like cool. You know what I mean? Like we're like America, but we don't have a lot of the weird, like kind of hyper capitalist, everything is monetized sort of culture.
Right.
We were like, I was like, we get all the best parts of American culture, which is a lot of the time you guys' entertainment kind of offshoots. And like you said, you grew up kind of watching Canadian TV. We also grew up
Yeah.
watching a mix of Canadian and American shows. My family are like Big Brother people. If you ever watch Big Brother, like the U.S.
Sure,
Big
yeah,
Brother,
yeah,
we
yeah.
like grew up watching all that. A lot
I
of you
grew up
guys'
with, like-
sitcoms.
I grew up
movies.
with the Anna Green Gables
Okay,
specials.
okay, there you go.
And then I watched this show, this animated Canadian show called My Goldfish is Evil.
I have no idea what that is.
Really?
No,
okay,
not a clue.
it's like a late 2000s Canadian
There we
show.
go. I'm a couple years older than you, though.
That is true.
Yeah, so there might be a bit
How
of
old
a
are you?
divide there. I'm 27.
Okay, I'm 22, so
Yeah.
a little bit more than that.
Yeah, so
Anyway.
there's a bit of a divide there, but like I grew up watching like a lot of the same like Family Channel stuff.
Right,
like,
right.
I vibe with That's So Raven. a
We're
lot
in the
back
same.
day.
We're in the same range.
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So like there was that sort of thing, but we really. I don't know where it came from, but I distinctly remember when I was elementary school aged, I was very, very proud of not being American. No offense to you guys or anything like that. It's just that, one of the, like, it was drilled into us from a very young age that, like, we have things like, socialized healthcare, and that's a huge deal for us. That's something that makes us really unique. We're a very safe country. I mean, compared to a lot of other places, we have very low violent crime rates. Our crime rates, despite what some politicians might be trying to say, our crime rates are fractional of what they were 50 years ago, 20 years ago. There's been some short-term increases in that sense, but I think that kind of heavily correlates to the economic implications that kind of come from our current circumstances.
Sure.
But Canadian identity, I do believe, is distinct. Obviously, we have the intricacies of an entire part of our country that doesn't primarily speak English.
Right.
As kind of brought on by some later policies coming out of like the 70s that wanted to really dig the heels in to make Quebec a fully French place. They took all English off all the road signs and those sorts of things. So you have
Right.
this one province that speaks a distinct language. Also, we have a lot of indigenous populations in Canada as
Sure.
well, that we do not necessarily have the best track record with historically. And then, of course, we have all of the Anglophone Canadians who are just kind of those are the ones who are going to have the most congruency typically with Americans. And I
Sure.
think that there's a lot of analogs. You have your bigger city Canadians, like I grew up in Burnaby, Coquitlam, Langley, all suburbs of Vancouver. So there's a very distinct culture that comes with being from that place, and it's very metropolitan. It's very kind of progressive. It's very multicultural. Whereas, you go into more interior, the interior of BC or more prairie provinces and those sorts of things, you tend to find, much like here, the rural-urban divide is very significant. So
Sure.
you'll tend to find people who lean quite a bit more right, haven't been exposed to that same multiculturalism that people who grew up in, major urban centers did and those sorts of things. So right now we're kind of seeing a lot of that come to a head, and I think that that's why, the current election cycle has been so interesting.
Well, let's get into that. I mean, maybe go into let's talk a little bit about the way or Canada is set up politically.
Okay,
And how that is being manifested in
yeah.
this election that's only a week away.
Exactly. So I think when it comes down to the American political system, to my understanding, you guys obviously have your municipal leadership.
Mhm.
It's like mayors and city councils and those sorts of things. And then you have your House of Representatives, you have your Senate, and then you have your executive branch. Is that
Yes.
a correct assessment?
Yeah. So we have municipal government, which it just kind of depends
Yeah.
around the country how that's set up. And you have states, which are just like a mini version of the
Gotcha.
national government.
Yeah.
Governor is the president.
Oh, okay, there we go.
And there's usually like a House of Representatives and a Senate
Yes.
in each state, and then there's the big version of that.
Indeed.
federally.
So yeah, Canada runs a little bit differently. We have our municipal governments very much the same as you guys. So we'll have our city councils, we have our mayor. And then there's a lot of distinct responsibilities that the municipality holds that can't be infringed upon by other levels of government, or conventionally shouldn't be. We'll get into our constitution later.
Sure.
But conventionally, the different levels of government tend to stick to what is within their mandate.
Yeah.
So when you have your municipal government, that's going to come down to things like development approvals, roadworks, zoning.
Yep.
Local like property taxation and those sorts of things, and then you move on to your provincial. So your provincial government is always going to control things much more directly from an institutional level. So your healthcare is going to be largely defined by your provincial government. The federal government has some influence when it comes down to specific transfer payments. Like they sometimes will say, we'll give you X amount of funding if you do Y. So that's sort of how the federal branch will influence the provincial branch when it comes to things like education, healthcare, housing initiatives, those sorts of things. So that's all falls under provincial mandate, and then we have the leader of the provincial parliament or legislative assembly. It's different depending on where you are. Is called the premier. So we have a premier for each province and territory. And then moving up to the federal branch, we have just, that's pretty self-explanatory. They handle things like, like crime laws. They handle things like our international, like foreign policy, and those sorts of things. So there's those distinctions, but the unique thing about Canada is obviously that we don't actually have an executive branch. We don't vote for who we want to be prime minister. We vote for what party we want to represent us municipally, provincially, and federally. And a lot of the times, those different jurisdictions will also have different parties to choose from.
So, what are the major parties in Canada federally, and who?
So federally,
Where do they stand?
Yeah, so federally we have. See, Canada, you have a lot of options, actually, and parties come and go, but the current landscape of parties, we obviously have the two big tents, which is the Liberal Party of Canada, currently headed by Mark Carney. We have the Conservative Party of Canada, which is currently headed by Pierre Poilievre. We have the New Democratic Party, who up until recently was my party of choice federally. It's headed by Jagmeet Singh. We have the Bloc Québécois, which is they're like the Quebec Separatist Party, but
Mhm.
we'll get into them a bit later. Headed by Yves-François Blanchet. And then we lastly have, we have the PPC, the People's Party of Canada, which is a newer federal party that was founded by a conservative offshoot who lost a leadership election in 2019.
Right.
So we have the People's Party, and then lastly we have the Green Party, which typically will only ever have one seat in Parliament at a given time. Their leadership over the past couple years has been pretty rough and disorganized. They actually have two party leaders right now, and that's been they have like two co-leaders, and that's been it's one of them is so new I don't even know his name.
Oh, I mean, the Green Party to the U.S. Try 8 party leaders. I'm
That's
just saying.
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that's
Yeah.
definitely interesting. But yeah, the PPC is too new. They've never held a seat in Parliament. The Greens usually only get 1 or 2 maximum.
Sure.
The Liberals and the Conservatives tend to make up the vast majority of seats.
Those are the big boys.
Yeah, and then you have the NDP, which is in this weird middle ground where in the past 15 years they have had one opportunity to be the official opposition, but have failed to repeat that sort of successful election.
And they're like in the 20 to 30 seats
Yeah,
range.
they tend to be around there, right? Because our federal parliament has 338 seats. So I believe don't get me going on the math on how much is a majority.
Sure,
But historically, at least for the past 2 Liberal-led terms, it's been a coalition government between the Liberals and the NDP, headed by Justin Trudeau, who recently stepped down. As it so happens, he stepped down from his post as prime minister, leaving a primary open, and that's how Mark Carney became prime minister without a vote.
Why did Justin Trudeau step down?
Oh boy. So I guess a good way to kind of look at this is the Canadian left. I would consider Canada, although the Overton window has definitely moved to the right in recent years, I think Canada dominantly still remains to be a center-left nation, very socially progressive, with very centrist economic policies. Maybe not by you guys' standards. They still seem pretty left-wing by you guys' standards, but for at least what we're used to, that's kind of how we've defined ourselves. And the thing about Trudeau is the Canadian public doesn't vote leaders in. We vote leaders out. You know, the Canadian left has a convention called ABC voting, which is a strategic vote for anything but conservative. So ABC voters, which I historically have typically been, is our first past the post voting system with so many different parties in the mix typically leads a lot of people to just vote strategically rather than for who they think is the best fit. On principle, for many years, I voted New Democrat because I thought that they were the best suited to lead. I no longer think they are the best suited to lead, unfortunately. But Justin Trudeau has been largely soured in a way that I think is actually kind of unfair. You know, he brought a lot of very positive things to our country. Obviously, one of his first major initiatives was the legalization of cannabis federally. Obviously, because all of our crime laws are kind of consolidated to the federal branch anyway, that just automatically made it legal everywhere. Another thing is in collaboration, largely forced by the NDP, we had our federal pharmacare plan, our federal vision and dental plan that extended our already socialized healthcare plans to include vision, dental, prescriptions under a specific household earnings amount. I believe the cutoff is $75,000 per year. So another thing was like $10 a day childcare was really revolutionary for a lot of families. There was people paying like thousands of dollars a month to have their kids go to daycare prior to being school age so that they could still work. So Trudeau had a massive hand in reducing the burden on young families in that way. And then what I personally love the most about Justin Trudeau's policies was his COVID handling. I think that his handling of the pandemic was really incredible, and I think that, ironically, despite my glowing review, it is also the reason that he became so unpopular.
So what was his COVID policy? Why was it effective in your view? / why did people not like it?
So what COVID did was it created a very, very significant divide between the Canadian left and the Canadian right, where there was people who very firmly believed that everyone needed the vaccine. You got to go get the vaccine. We need herd immunity now. We need to protect, the most vulnerable people in our population, and you had the people on the right who were very much like, you can't tell me what to do. I don't want the government mandating me putting a needle in my arm.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, at least a valid, consideration to make.
Yeah, to that extent, I do. I'm a pretty anti-vax person, but phrase like that, yeah.
Well, but at the same time, it was never. So that's the thing, is that's how a lot of people took it. A lot of people took the vaccine mandates that did go into place as them being forced to take something, which in reality, that's not what it was. It was a policy that handled the realities of the situation, which is we're dealing with a public health crisis that is very unpredictable. We know people are dying, and we don't know much else.
Gotta do something.
We have to do something.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, what happened was we rolled out the COVID vaccines very quickly. COVID vaccines to this day are still available, and they're always free. I'm not sure if they were free for you guys.
They were free. At the very least, like the first 2 shots and like the first booster.
Yeah.
Were definitely free.
Okay, good.
And at least in Washington State, I suspect in many other parts of the country, vaccines like the COVID and flu vaccine are essentially free at a pharmacy because they're just like pharmacies just order them and they're on the shelf and they're gonna go bad.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they just want to use them.
That makes sense. Okay, yeah.
So they're either free or like very, very low cost.
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, like so there was the people who were like, you really need to go get this vaccine. The federal government was like, go get your vaccine. And if you don't get your vaccine, there's going to be certain barriers put in place. So for example, like bars and restaurants, you couldn't go to a bar, you couldn't go to a restaurant. You couldn't go to a concert venue. You know what I mean?
It was like that here for like 2 seconds, and then people got mad.
So we rode that out. I think that the mandates were there for about 18 months. So it was a really long period of time. There were certain people, like for example, healthcare workers who chose not to get the vaccine were laid off.
Yeah,
postal workers who refused to get it were laid off. Like government employees were required if they were deemed to have a lot of public contact. So that caused a lot of uproars from people in regards to just they felt like their freedoms were being infringed upon. And it became this really intense movement that kind of was born out of other frustrations that were already taking place within the Canadian political landscape. It is no secret that under Justin Trudeau, and I won't say, I don't want to put it like under Justin Trudeau because the most visible outcomes occurred under Justin Trudeau, but our fate was written back under Chrétien in the 90s.
Sure.
So the most visibly unfortunate development in the current Canadian economy is the fact that housing has, by and large, become completely inaccessible to like 90% of people. Our rents are through the roof. Thankfully, I live in British Columbia, where our provincial government does have rent controls in place, which is awesome. But Ontario, for example, any new build built past 2018 has no rent control. So it's there's those intricacies there where housing to purchase has become shockingly expensive. I think the average detached house in Canada, no matter where you are, like countrywide, if you average out the price of every single one, it's over $1 million.
Wow.
So the housing market has very much been sort of gamified. It's become like a sort of like its own like crypto kind of gambling scheme where you have people who will buy up a bunch of property. In the past, it's been heavily scapegoated as being like foreign actors and buyers and those sorts of things, when in reality they make up like 3% of purchases.
Sure.
Something like 60% of the investor class, the housing investor class in Canada, is actually just mom and pop landlords. Is just regular, people who have leveraged their investments to taking out like housing equity lines of credit to buy more houses. There's something like 30% of Canadian homeowners own more than one home, which has led to this massive divide for people who don't come from generational wealth and don't have access to the types of down payments that are necessary. I mean, I live in a suburb. I'm trying to think Langley to Vancouver is pretty similar to Bellingham to Seattle, in my opinion. As an analog. And imagine if studio apartments in Bellingham started at like $449,000. Like for $449,000 for like a 300 square foot space.
I'm trying to think of what that would translate to rent wise.
No, yeah, that's to purchase. That's to
purchase,
purchase.
yeah.
So it's kind of there's this massive lack of opportunity for young people in Canada right now. Obviously, our healthcare infrastructure, depending on where you are, is varying levels of broken. It has not kept up with population increases. There's been a massive influx of immigration post-COVID, which has been very controversial in its own right. But the anti-vax stuff is what really poisoned Trudeau. Not to get too far off topic, because I noticed myself kind of dwindling.
No, you're good. This is important context.
Yeah, definitely. So by the time the COVID pandemic rolled around, Trudeau had been actively in power for roughly 5 years. And in that time, we had seen a massive explosion in housing prices that had technically started under the previous administration, actually. Housing prices in Canada have been multiplying since the 90s. We used to have a federal housing program where the federal government was heavily invested in actually producing new builds. In the 90s, under Jean Chrétien, and his I believe he was finance minister at the time, was Paul Martin, who later became prime minister himself. They reformed the Canadian Mortgage and Housing, CMHC. I don't remember what the last C stands for. I probably should. But this, something like that. The CMHC used to handle all those new builds. They acted as the general contractors for the jobs, and a large amount of social housing was produced that way. Back in the 70s, like 1 in every 5 Canadians lived in some kind of socialized unit. So we used to have massive social housing investment in Canada. And in the 90s, they were all like, well, houses are cheap. We can afford, like, why are we spending all this money, keeping everyone's taxes high, building all these damn houses, when we could just make things more favorable for investors, and then they could do all the work for us?
Sounds like a very 1990s liberal democracy decision
definitely.
to make.
It was a very neoliberal decision, and what they did was they reformed the CMHC into a mortgage insurer. So essentially, whenever somebody who puts a certain amount of money below 20% as a down payment, they had to pay a premium on that amount to insure their loan, essentially. So their mortgage would be covered if they were to default by this mortgage insurance that was facilitated by the government. So they got out of the business of building homes, and they started having certain policy initiatives that were meant to make building more units within a home attractive. So they gave massive subsidies to private homeowners who wanted to renovate and add like second units to their houses and those sorts of things. There was massive subsidies kind of given to improve existing properties. And the thought at the time was that as new houses are built by the private market, that will inherently make the older houses cheaper, because, it's not as premium of an item, it's going to depreciate. In reality, what happened is all of those reforms that they put into place, all of these ways that they made it like a super attractive private market investment, just poured dollars into the Canadian housing market and blew up this massive bubble where investors and mom and pop landlords, foreign investors, domestic investors, corporations, were all kind of having a fire sale for like 20 years in the Canadian housing market, getting as much property as they could, and then those who were already in specific areas that were really affluent, like West Point Grey in Vancouver, for example, have big NIMBY cultures. So they don't want any more units to be produced, because houses make more money than people in Canada. That is kind of the best way to look at it, is houses make more money than people in Canada. There is no occupation that you can go into in the entire country that will pay you more than real estate investment if you are successful at it. So that has turned housing not into a necessity, but this sort of just like trading card game for rich people, which has obviously left people in my position pretty, it's hard,
Yeah.
It's hard, and our prospects have been damaged. So come COVID and these more direct sort of infringements on the average Canadian's real material living standards start coming into play. You're not allowed to go to the restaurant anymore. No, you can't go see that concert. No, you can't come to this
People are
fair.
starting to get really frustrated.
Yeah, so like people are looking, they're all like, okay, if I go to the hospital, I'm gonna have to wait 12 hours in a goddamn waiting room if I like broke my arm or something. I'm gonna have to. If I need a specific scan, it's gonna take me like 2 or 3 weeks before I can actually get in to see anybody. When I try and go and rent a house, like I've got to deal with a shoebox that I can barely afford that I've got to pay like $1,500 a month for. When I want to go buy a home, like I don't make enough money where I could even think of saving money to buy a home with.
I will say, at least in Washington State or like the Bellingham, Seattle like strip,
Yeah.
housing prices are also very like they're a little bit lower than that,
Indeed.
but it's like pretty.
Yeah,
It's pretty bad.
Well, that's another thing is a lot of looping back to your question about about why is Justin Trudeau so unpopular. I think that he's been made the scapegoat of a lot of things that are really just like global market
Right.
flows. Things that are not unique to Canada, but people don't look outside our borders nearly enough to actually identify that these things are happening elsewhere, and maybe they're not up to our prime minister solely.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a parallel with Joe Biden,
Mm-hmm.
frankly. And I mean, not that I'm a Joe Biden fan.
Indeed.
There were like reasons beyond this why he lost, but people were feeling bad about how they were doing the economy,
Mm-hmm.
and he was the guy that was in charge.
Yeah, and that's very much kind of what happened to Trudeau as well. It's just very much like economy sucks. I have no prospects. If you have money and property right now, it's the best time ever for you. But
Right. But that's
the
not a
vast
lot of
majority of people
Yeah.
don't have money and property, so they're not having a great time.
And so out of this bubbling over frustration,
Yeah, well, people are all like,
rises-
I'm never going to afford a house. I can't go to the hospital and get seen in a regular amount of time. Like, I can't do anything that I want to do. And now you're telling me I can't go to the bar on Friday after I get my paycheck? I can't get a paycheck because I work for Canada Post and you guys have taken away my job because I won't get a vaccine? Like, is that seriously what we're doing?
yeah.
So that's what led to the kind of trucker convoy era of Canadian politics, which is what Pierre Poilievre kind of came up with.
You preempted me.
Yeah.
I was like, out of this rises Pierre Poilievre.
Yes. So Pierre Poilievre became the Conservative Party leader very quickly following the 2020 election. So there was a snap election called in 2020 by Justin
Or the
Trudeau.
2021.
2021, pardon me. Called by Justin Trudeau because he thought that he would be able to form majority government. At the time, he had a coalition government with Jagmeet Singh under the NDP. And he, in a very short-sighted act, decided to call an election less than 2 years after the previous election, trying to consolidate power so that he didn't have to work with the NDP anymore, and he actually ended up losing seats.
That's funny. That is funny.
And it was after that election that Pierre became Conservative Party leader. So Pierre has been a Canadian politician. He's been an MP since 2005. It is the only. A lot of people do bring this up that it's the only job he's ever had. Politics. Yeah. He was a. He did like cold calling for the Conservative Party when he was in university. There's some rumblings that he may have worked for like some kind of like car insurer at some point or something like that, but no proof of any sort of thing.
Sure.
So for 20 years, what has made him so politically successful and what has kept him in his seat for that period of time really comes down to the fact that he's just a really effective orator, and he's very good at getting under the skin of whoever he's targeting.
It's kind of a firebrand.
Yeah, he's a ripper. He's there to rip down and hold the sitting government to account on what Canadians care about. And I don't want to make Pierre Poilievre out to be some kind of like folk hero, but his supporters definitely do see him that way.
Yeah.
They see him as this sort of like Ben Shapiro-like figure who will dismantle the left with facts and logic. And it's not really, it never really comes to manifest. They just kind of see him in that way.
Yeah.
So Pierre Poilievre ends up actually, his power comes from being vague, in my opinion. None of his policy initiatives actually have like frameworks presented. As of this filming, he still doesn't have a costed platform out, and the election is already undergoing.
Wait, sorry, repeat that.
He still does not have a costed platform out as of today's date.
I'm assuming the other parties do?
Yeah, he's the last one in line so far.
He's just running for prime minister.
Yeah. No, exactly. So, well, the Conservative Party is running for federal party leadership. We don't elect prime ministers in Canada. But but that's actually been a feature of a lot of conservative parties across Canada recently. Has been they've been banking on what's vague. You know, they've been trying to say less. Conservative candidates have been avoiding debates this federal election cycle. They have been avoiding town halls and interactions with the public as much as possible, because there's this really funny thing that happens is, you know, a lot of Canadians just want change. You know, that's why I think the decline of Justin Trudeau and the rise of Mark Carney makes so much sense, is because there are so many people, even on the left, who are so done with Justin Trudeau. There was so much apathy that they were willing to vote Conservative just to have someone new. Mm-hmm. And then when Justin Trudeau stepped down and made that space for a new leadership election to take place, which is only voted on by party members, by the way. It's like primary, same kind of thing as you guys do down here.
Yep.
And then Mark Carney was given, you know, the role. He overwhelmingly won the leadership race, and he's got a great resume. So he gave a lot of Canadians another option, and that was majorly to the detriment of Pierre, who had very little other than the ability to really effectively get angry with you.
So they could. Gave. Would you say gave Canadian liberal left-leaning Canadians permission to vote Liberal without like kind of feeling like they're voting Liberal?
Yes, exactly. Okay. That's exactly what happened. And there's been a very vested effort from Pierre to try and paint Mark Carney as just a continuation of Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. Up to this point, it's kind of failed, except with his most direct base. There was a lot of people who were all like, I don't really like Pierre and how vague he is with some of these things. I don't really like how he kind of says weird things about like women's biological clocks and stuff. But like, we've had 10 years of this and it's not working out, so we kind of need something else. Right. You know what I mean? Mark Carney came in and gave them something else that wasn't insane.
Yeah.
And that's why, I mean, as of right now, I think that the Liberals are polling like 70%, which would be the biggest majority that they've gotten in at least 10 years.
So by your reckoning, it seems like the Liberals are going to win next week. As of a week out. As of a week out. This is not like a hard and fast prediction.
The only polls that matter are exit polls. But,
sure.
But the polling currently is leaning that way, yes. That it will be a successful Conservative bid, which 4 months ago would have been unthinkable.
A successful Liberal bid.
Yes, pardon me.
Yes.
A successful Liberal bid. A successful Conservative bid was looked at as the only possibility.
Right. 4 months ago, it was like, oh, the Liberals are going to get wiped out.
It's going to be a 2011 all over again.
Yeah.
That's what they were looking like. They thought the NDP was going to be the official opposition again. The Liberals are going to get wiped off the map, and Pierre Poilievre was going to be Prime Minister.
Yeah.
What I think a lot of people didn't expect was just how popular Mark Carney would be. I've got to give some credit to Jon Stewart really quick, because
you had him on the show.
He did, and that was the first introduction to a lot of Canadians even as to who Mark Carney was. He was not an established political figure in Canada in the same way that, like, you know, a Joe Biden would be, or like a Donald Trump at this point. He's somebody who has had a career in central banking.
He's a bureaucrat.
Yeah, exactly. He's an advisor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's not somebody who has ever like run as a politician in Canada. So even as of right now, being the Prime Minister, he's not actually elected to any seat in Parliament, which in itself is pretty funny. Which is kind of conventionally what necessitates the leadership race or the federal election happening now, as opposed to in October when it would typically happen.
Well, see, hey, Jon Stewart having him on the show, that shows that both the American right and the American left can meddle in Canadian politics.
Exactly. You know what? But I think that Jon Stewart appearance really gave people a breath of fresh air.
Sure. Because
they were like, oh my God, there's an adult in the room again. You know, unfortunately, as much as I hate to say it, like, I've met Jagmeet Singh multiple times. I like the guy as a person. But in the grand scheme of things, he's completely squandered the legacy that Jack Layton left behind when he passed away. The NDP was the official opposition for those 4 years, and they were strong. They did a really, really great job at appealing to Canadian workers and really mobilizing support from Canadian workers. Whereas the current NDP has just been this very, like, weird smorgasbord of, like, whatever the popular left-wing idea is at the time. You know, it's been like very odd and very inconsistent, and a lot of the messaging and a lot of the voting has been very inconsistent in recent years, and it feels almost as reactionary to me as a lot of what Pierre does. But it's instead of being
Huh.
reactionary with like a right wing populist kind of
So the left
slant,
wing.
it's the left wing populist slant.
But it's reactionary. It's reacting.
Yeah,
It's not.
yeah, it's
yeah.
not like these properly thought out things. And I mean, a lot of people would probably call me out on that and say like, "Hey, we wouldn't have the federal pharmacare and dental care plans if it wasn't for Jagmeet," which is true.
Yeah.
I can give him at least that. But in this most recent election cycle, in this past year or so, since those W's were had, he hasn't really done much of anything. He's just
Sure.
been Trudeau bashing as much as Pierre was, and
Yeah.
kind of just going in and saying the Liberal Party won't do this, the Liberal Party won't do that, which is fine. But what are your ideas then, my friend?
So what? So the NDP and the Bloc and the Greens, but I don't know how much we'll talk about the Greens, are also running.
Yes.
And none of them are going to
They have no shot.
win a
for me.
majority, of course.
No,
but
no,
what?
no, no,
so
no, no, no,
and
no.
they know that.
Yes.
So
yes,
like,
of course.
what is their what are they running for? What is their line? I feel like the Bloc is like running to be a partner in government, right?
Yeah, it's very much that sort of thing. So Canada, like Quebec, has a lot of very uniquely slanted benefits in their direction.
Quebec's direction, you mean?
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So the like for example, the Canada Revenue Agency is like our version of the IRS.
Sure.
Quebec doesn't pay. It doesn't do any business with the CRA at all. They have their own.
That's
Yeah,
well,
they
that's
have.
beyond the American imagination.
Yeah, they have like their own provincial IRS type thing. It's got a French name that I don't know how to pronounce and I won't butcher here.
Sure.
But like they have a lot of, like I said, just protections in regards to their linguistics. In the 70s, like I said, they stopped teaching English in schools. They ripped English off all the road signs.
Secularism is a big thing for
Is
them
a
too.
massive thing in Quebec because
Yeah.
they have, unfortunately, a pretty brutal political history when it comes to the Catholic Church there.
Right.
There was some, the first governments in Quebec were kind of just formed by the church and administered by the church, and
Yeah.
there's some echoes there for sure. So you typically see a culture in Quebec that is militantly secular. That is a divide with the rest of Canada.
Yeah.
There is a big, I think, in Anglophone like populations, there's much more of a tolerance to religious, like a breadth of religions all having a place.
Sure.
Whereas like in Quebec, they'd be all like, you can't wear a hijab in like a government building. You know, it's very interesting to say
Yeah.
the least. But yes, they're militantly secular there. I'm trying to think of, obviously all federal MPs have to speak French. It's more of a convention than an actual than a written rule or anything of the sort.
Yeah.
But it's very rare for for example like a cabinet minister to not speak French.
It's expected that they have that ability.
Yeah, exactly. Because obviously we are a bilingual nation, but I think
Yeah.
that it's interesting that doesn't cut both ways. Like, for example, there's no mandates regarding like indigenous languages that are still spoken, and
Right.
That's why I appreciate like my provincial government, David Eby's BC NDP. They've done a lot of work towards reconciliation. And acknowledging truth in a lot of our history when it comes to our past
Sure.
with indigenous populations in Canada. So in BC, it's not rare to go to like a park or something and see both the English name and the traditional indigenous name for that park
That's neat.
listed on like signs and stuff like that. Land acknowledgements are a big thing in any formal political I went to the legislature a few weeks ago and I watched Question Period and met with some sitting government MLAs and some opposition MLAs
In BC.
in BC.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, even before any session, they always begin with a land acknowledgement and that sort of thing. It's very standard. Any meeting will typically begin that way in the political sphere. So a lot of people say like land acknowledgements are stupid and they don't make any difference. And I think that has some merit if that's all you're doing.
Right.
But I think that it is an important part of like a comprehensive sort of approach to truth and reconciliation
Sure.
that is very valuable. And this that I'm saying right now is a very controversial issue in Canada, especially coming down to like how the education system kind of approached things in the earlier days. So like for example, my parents' generation were taught that Indigenous Canadians had treaties that had been upheld by the Canadian government and all was well and good, and if they're yapping, it's just because they made a bad deal. The reality is, what I was taught was that a lot of those treaties were never upheld to the degree that they were supposed to be. So, I mean, I think a good analog for this is 40 acres and a mule. Whereas for us, we also had specific land that was supposed to be given based on population, and then population was massively undercounted, which led to very restricted policies restricted like land returning and stuff like that. Land back is something that gets talked about a lot as well. More indigenous governance over the land that technically is theirs. And we see a lot more of that now. Like many, depending on where you are, some municipalities will have to consult with the local indigenous band to be able to do new development projects. And those sorts of things. That's kind of like a unique facet as well. But when I was at the legislature a few weeks ago, it was really interesting to me to see this microcosm of all of the political attitudes that exist within Canada now. The BC Conservative Party was a nothing party 2 years ago. They hadn't won a seat in Parliament in decades, and they ended up kind of coming out of a schism within the BC Liberal Party, which is actually not federally associated with the Liberals at all. They were always much more associated with the federal Conservatives, ironically, despite the name. It is, yeah. So that's I'm not sure if I've mentioned it so far, but different levels of government in Canada, they have like distinct political parties and institutions and those sorts of things. So the BC NDP is a distinct party from the federal NDP, even though they are affiliated with one another in that they talk, but they don't have coordinated policy initiatives or anything like that. The BC Liberals, which reformed into the BC United shortly before they folded as a party entirely a month before an election, they were always much more aligned with the federal Conservatives. And what actually caused the BC Liberal, then BC United schism was a man named John Roustad had some disagreements. I think a lot of it actually had to do with Indigenous relations and COVID handling between members of the BC Liberal Party. So he split off and revitalized the BC Conservative banner and started leeching candidates from the BC Liberals. And what that translated to is suddenly there's all these people under the Conservative banner who are elected as Liberals, and now they're identifying as these conservative people who what it essentially became was like a pretty far-right party in the province. And then they ended up becoming, as of the most recent election, the official opposition. Certain ridings were won by 10 votes.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
There were certain ridings that were literally won. That's how divided it was. And that election had a lot more to do with things like, unfortunately, a lot of it was like trans rights. So that's something that's one thing that is unique about Canada, probably not unique at all, actually, now that I say it out loud, is that we import a lot of you guys' culture war stuff.
Yeah.
So when it comes down to that whole like Canadian culture is like very American and like how we speak and what we, how we operate, what we're used to. But a side effect of that is that, like, hey, they're talking about abortion down there. And I know that that's been like decided law here forever.
Well, maybe we should talk about it.
But we should talk about this now, actually, I think, It's really important that we come to a decision on this thing that hasn't been a topic of conversation in decades.
Well, I think that's a good way to kind of round it out, is that this election seems to be so deeply influenced by the Canadian-U.S. relationship. So this is the one and only time, and I can't believe it's on camera, that you will be catching me thanking Donald Trump for something. And what I am thanking Donald Trump for is unifying Canadians to a degree that we have not been unified in what I think is like I feel about this election a lot how I felt about the 2015 election, which is the first election I ever voted in, where people actually are unified and trying to move in a positive direction together. A lot of the 51st state rhetoric, a lot of the tariff actions towards us and those sorts of things have really mobilized Canadians who might have been sensitive to like the Republican Party's approach prior because they like getting angry with them. A lot of those people have been like, whoa, okay, this is not what I signed up for. Sure.
Like, I don't support this. Like, no, elbows up. Like, let's go. And that's why I think Mark Carney has been so successful in such a short period of time, is not just because he's a new guy and he comes off as very competent, he has a very well-rounded out resume, but because he came in at the perfect time and seems like the best guy who's going to deal with Trump. And a lot of people do see him that way. If you look at any of the polling in regards to that specific issue, who do you believe is going to, actually stand up to Trump and really like protect Canadian sovereignty and our rights?
It's Mark Carney.
It's Mark Carney.
Yeah.
So him coming in at the perfect time, like I mean, I studied political science. I think were you a poli-sci
History
major?
and poli-sci.
Yeah, history and poli-sci.
Yes.
So you know the power of a common enemy. And
Absolutely.
we are watching that play out in Canada in real time. No one trusts Pierre because he's imported too much American culture war stuff, and he doesn't do it himself. He'll just do it by meeting with Jordan Peterson, or going and he'll let other people talk about him, but he won't say anything in regards to it. Like Matt Walsh or something will say something positive about Pierre Poilievre.
Sure.
Donald Trump himself will say something positive about Pierre Poilievre.
Poilievre will just kind of absorb it. But,
He just doesn't really say anything, because that's the current conservative playbook, is say less.
Yeah.
And the less you say, the less opportunities you have to slip up. So now that he's being faced with somebody who actually has policy initiatives that really speak to what is the political soul of Canada, which is social progressivism and fiscal centrist policy.
Carney just doesn't have the vulnerabilities
No,
Poilievre does.
no, not at all. Not at all. And I think that Pierre has spent too much of his time as a party leader only knowing how to Trudeau bash. He didn't actually have these big comprehensive ideals. Like, I mean, for example, his housing plan is essentially just to turn housing into a buy 20, get one free program. He wants to eliminate government sales tax on all new builds up to, I think, 1.5 million that is accessible to anybody. So whoever's the first person to put money down on that $1.5 million house is going to be the one to get it. And then when you average out the GST savings, every time you buy 10 properties, 20 properties, one pays for itself, because you've gotten these massive discounts, and that's incredible. But what that does is it incentivizes the building of $1.5 million homes to maximize gains. Mm-hmm. And most people can't afford a $1.5 million home. His other big idea is to set quotas for municipalities to meet and then restrict their federal funding if they fail to meet them, without offering them any additional resources to fix the problem.
Cool.
So he's essentially like, if you can't do it with the resources you have, we're going to take away those resources that you do have so you can do even less. And I'm very interested to see how that goes for him if he does become prime minister. Kill me. But the Liberal plan for housing is a bit better. I don't think it's perfect, but he also wants to, like Mark Carney also wants to eliminate GST on new builds to a certain dollar value, but he only wants to be accessible to first-time home buyers, so at least it's targeted. I still do think it kind of reproduces a similar issue.
Sure.
But what he's done to accentuate that is he also wants to get Canada back into the business of building homes, which is something that I think is very necessary. A national housing plan that includes the government acting as a general contractor for a lot of these builds. Mm-hmm. My day job is actually in the construction industry. I work in accounts receivable for a construction supply company. So I see a lot of what Carney wants to do as a positive step in the right direction. Sure. I think the NDP is the best housing plan, personally. You notice that these are the three parties that I tend to refer to because they tend to be the three that are the most relevant.
Right. You're not in Quebec, so not the Bloc. And then the Greens seem to be not all that organized.
They only ever get seats in, like, Victoria, BC.
Yeah, so...
where Elizabeth May is from.
Yeah.
So that kind of tends to be the only Green stronghold.
So it's really just those three options.
It's really just those
and
three
I
options.
assume you're not going to be voting for the, what is it, the PP's?
The People's Party of Canada.
Yeah, probably not.
No, I will not be voting
for
for Bernier's PPC and his smart populist brand. I won't be doing that. I don't think it's particularly smart populism myself. But that's kind of, we don't need to talk. I honestly, I almost don't want to give the airtime to Bernier because he's essentially just this psychotic reactionary who screeches about, like, vaccines and immigrants, and no one really pays him any attention. His party's never won a seat. So
there you go.
Forget him.
That's probably good.
Indeed.
Well, we actually went for about an hour, if you can believe it. Yeah.
Wow. And I could have gone all day, honestly.
No, it sounds legit. I always end every
Yes.
episode with this question.
Okay.
And you can interpret this however you want, either for like the world or for your personal life.
Ooh, I love a good open-ended question. Hell yeah.
What are you looking forward to?
What am I looking forward to? Oh, geez. What am I looking forward to? That's a good question. The easy answer is the Andor second season that comes out tonight. But,
Oh yeah.
but,
No, I haven't
but
seen season 1 yet. Yeah, I know.
Finn,
so
what are
many
you
people have gotten
doing?
mad at me about
You know,
this.
you have to. It's some of the best Star Wars there is. But in the more grand scheme of things, I'm really looking forward to finishing my undergrad.
Nice.
I was a mature student. I didn't start studying until I was 23.
Sure.
I'm 27 now, and I've got less than a year to go. So
Congratulations.
yeah, thank you very much. So I'm really looking forward to graduating, and I have an internship that I'm kind of gunning for. So we'll see how that works out. But yeah,
Cool.
I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah,
Nice.
that's where it
awesome.
is. I appreciate you having me on, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on, Zach.
Yeah, cheers.
That's international diplomacy right there.
Hell yeah, 100%.
All right. Bye, everyone.